December 18, 1944. Stavelot, Belgium. Snow lashes across the narrow Ardennes road like shrapnel from the heavens. The night is moonless, the air thick with diesel smoke and fear. Along the frozen valley, the rumble of armored engines echoes through the dark. Tiger tanks, Panzer IVs, and the grinding clatter of half-tracks moving under strict radio silence. At the head of the column rides Oberst Joachim Richter, a veteran panzer commander of the Wehrmacht's elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler. His gloved hand grips the hatch rim as his tank crawls forward through the black forest. In the distance, faint orange flickers rise above the treetops. The town of Stavelot is burning. Richter's orders are clear: push west, cross the Amblev River, and seize Allied fuel. Without it, their armored offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied lines, will die before it ever reaches the Meuse. The colonel knows every liter of fuel counts. As dawn bleeds into the horizon, the column halts at a bridge choked with debris and wrecked jeeps. American bodies lie frozen in grotesque shapes along the roadside. A Sherman tank smolders, its turret blown clean off. The acrid smell of cordite and burnt rubber stings the nostrils. Richter's driver coughs beneath his scarf. "Verdamped," Richter mutters. "They fought hard here." A forward scout approaches, panting through the cold. "Herr Oberst, we found something large. Allied fuel depot just beyond the ridge. Dozens of tankers, maybe more." Richter's heart kicks in his chest. Fuel. The one thing they lacked. The lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg. He signals his men forward. Within minutes, Panzer Grenadiers sweep over the ridge and into a snowy clearing. There, gleaming beneath the morning sun, stand rows of American fuel trucks. Hundreds of drums and tankers abandoned in retreat. The smell of gasoline hangs heavy in the air. He steps down from his tank, boots crunching in the snow. The depot is enormous, enough to refuel an entire panzer regiment. 50,000 gallons, the quartermaster estimates breathlessly. Richter allows himself a rare smile. For a fleeting moment, the impossible dream of victory returns. The idea that maybe, just maybe, Germany could turn back the tide. He watches as his men begin transferring fuel, filling jerry cans, laughing despite the cold. It feels like life itself has returned to their steel beasts. But as the colonel gazes westward, toward the Meuse and the unseen Allied lines beyond, a darker thought takes root. They had found the prize. But could they even use it? Their trucks were running dry, their supply lines stretched and shattered. The roads behind them were clogged with wrecks, and Allied aircraft would soon return once the weather cleared. He looks down at his fuel gauge, the needle trembling at 1/4. He knows. They can't even transport what they've taken. The snow begins to fall harder, covering the American insignia on the tankers. Men cheer as engines roar to life again, but Richter can already feel the hollow echo beneath it all. Victory tastes like gasoline. Sharp, fleeting, and poisonous. The convoy rolled westward out of Stavelot at dawn, engines straining beneath the bitter cold. Snow crunched beneath tank treads as Oberst Joachim Richter's column wound through the narrow Ardennes roads, a procession of steel monsters coughing black smoke into the frozen air. Behind them, the captured American tankers rattled, each one a fragile lifeline filled with precious fuel. But within hours, the illusion of momentum began to crack. At the first crossroads beyond Trois Ponts, the lead Panther ground to a halt. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. A mechanic scrambled out from the back, his breath forming a ghostly cloud as he shouted, "Verdammt! The lines are frozen." Others soon followed. One after another, tanks began stalling, their engines choking in the sub-zero temperatures. Richter cursed under his breath. The fuel they'd captured was perfect, high-octane American gas, but their logistics weren't. The German trucks that could carry the fuel were already far behind, bogged down by traffic jams, mines, and counterattacks. The colonel's entire forward column was running on fumes. By midday, the offensive pace had slowed to a crawl. Soldiers shivered in open half-tracks, their faces pale with exhaustion. The forest was deathly quiet except for the occasional thud of distant artillery. They passed burned-out jeeps and scattered helmets, remnants of the surprised American units that had been overrun days earlier. At a makeshift command post near a barn, Richter unfolded a damp map across the hood of his tank. Around him, staff officers muttered anxiously. "The bridge at Trois Ponts has been blown," one lieutenant reported. Our engineers can't repair it under fire. The Americans have regrouped on the western bank. Then we go north, Richter replied sharply. We'll push toward L'Église. Piper is there. He'll need this fuel. The mention of Joachim Piper, the ruthless SS Kampfgruppe leader, drew uneasy glances. Piper's men were already infamous. Their drive west had left a trail of burned villages and murdered prisoners. But even Piper was running dry. His Tigers and Panthers were abandoned by the dozens, their fuel tanks empty, crews trudging through the snow. As Richter's column crawled north, the sound of engines became rarer, replaced by the soft, ghostly hush of boots on snow. The men began towing trucks by hand, dragging jerry cans through the drifts. Every mile westward seemed to sap the strength from the army itself. That night, by the flickering light of a single oil lantern, Richter wrote a terse report for divisional command. We have secured approximately 50,000 gallons of Allied fuel. However, we lack the means to transport it. The roads are impassable. Enemy air power will resume with clear weather. Without sustained resupply, our armor will be immobilized within days. He paused, pen hovering above the paper, then added a final line. The enemy's strength lies not only in his fuel, but in his ability to move it. Outside, the wind howled across the valley. The colonel watched as one of his panzers, starved of gasoline, stood motionless. A steel giant turned to stone. The men huddled around fires, their shadows dancing on the snow like ghosts of a dying army. He knew then that they were fighting time, not the Allies. December 20th, 1944, near L'Église, Belgium. The snow had thickened into a blizzard by morning, muffling the thunder of artillery into a distant, mournful echo. Columns of German soldiers trudged along the road, silent, frostbitten shadows of what had once been the proud spearhead of Hitler's last offensive. Oberst Joachim Richter rode in the open hatch of his command Panther, his binoculars scanning the horizon. Ahead, through the haze, he could make out the black smoke of L'Église rising against the gray sky. That was where SS Sturmbannführer Joachim Piper had set up his defensive pocket, trapped, surrounded and low on everything that mattered. When Richter finally reached Piper's position, the sight stunned him. The once mighty Kampfgruppe Piper was reduced to wrecks and weariness. Burned-out Tigers littered the fields, their hatches frozen open, tracks buried in snow. Gaunt soldiers crouched beside dying fires, their faces hollow, their uniforms stiff with ice. Piper himself stood near a shattered church, his face streaked with soot, his eyes burning with defiance. He greeted Richter with a curt nod. "You brought the fuel?" Richter gestured toward the handful of captured American tankers behind his line. "Enough to move your column, perhaps. If the roads were clear." Piper gave a bitter laugh. "Roads? There are no roads left and only craters and corpses." He kicked at the snow where a discarded U.S. jerry can lay half buried. "We took their fuel, their trucks, their uniforms, but not their reach. That's what wins wars." Richter studied him for a moment. Piper's men had fought like wolves, but they were bleeding out in the wilderness. Their radios were dead, their supply lines severed. The Allies had regrouped faster than anyone in Berlin had imagined. American reinforcements were closing in from all sides, tanks grinding through the snow like an iron avalanche. Still, for one brief moment, the illusion of victory flickered. Late that afternoon, as the weather cleared, a burst of sunlight broke through the clouds, a cruel reminder of how quickly fortunes turned. The men cheered, mistaking the light for hope. Engines roared back to life as they transferred the captured gasoline into the few tanks still operational. The first Tiger moved, a massive beast crawling out of L'Église, its treads biting into the snow. Piper's men rallied behind it, chanting, "Vorwärts! Forward!" Richter watched them go, their figures swallowed by the white fog. For a heartbeat, it looked like the offensive might live again, but then came the distant hum. Low, rising, unmistakable. Allied thunderbolts. The first bomb struck near the church, shaking the ground with a deafening roar. Flames engulfed 2 fuel trucks, erupting into a column of black smoke that blotted out the sun. Men scattered in all directions. The second wave of fighters strafed the road, their .50 caliber guns tearing through the snow and steel alike. Richter dove for cover as shrapnel hissed overhead. The captured fuel, the lifeblood they had risked everything to seize, now turned into a funeral pyre. Burning gasoline ran like molten rivers across the snow, setting the frozen dead alight. When the airstrike ended, L'Église was silent, except for the crackle of fire. Piper's last functioning tank burned in the square. Richter rose slowly, brushing ash from his coat. The tankers were gone, the men scattered. The captured fuel, all 50,000 gallons, was now smoke drifting toward the clouds. He turned toward Piper, who stood motionless amid the wreckage. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. They both understood. The illusion was over. December 21st, 1944. L'Église, Belgium. The blizzard returned with a vengeance that night, as if nature itself wanted to bury the last trace of the German offensive. Flames from the destroyed depot still licked the sky, but the snow fell faster, smothering them, turning everything to ash-gray silence. Oberst Joachim Richter sat inside the remains of a farmhouse, its roof half collapsed, his gloved hands wrapped around a dented canteen filled with melted snow. Around him, his men dozed in exhaustion, rifles across their laps, helmets resting against their knees. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the faint rumble of American artillery. He could still smell the gasoline in his clothes. The same fuel that had promised life now reeked of death. It clung to everything: the burned snow, the twisted wreckage, the charred corpses of his own men. That night, Richter could not shake the image of those fuel trucks erupting into flame. 50,000 gallons of hope gone in seconds. He reached for his map, its edges torn and stained with soot. Red arrows still pointed west, toward the Meuse River and the distant dream of splitting the Allied lines. It was absurd now. The paper itself seemed to mock him. The arrows might as well have been drawn in blood. At dawn, his adjutant entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Herr Oberst," he said softly, "the last of our trucks is empty. We can't move the tanks anymore." Richter didn't look up. "How far to the rear?" 5 kilometers before the next roadblock. "The Americans are closing in from the south and east." He nodded slowly. It was over. The great Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final gamble, was collapsing under its own weight. The tanks were powerful, the soldiers brave, but the empire behind them was hollow. They had no oil fields left, no functioning industry that could keep pace with the enemy's endless convoys and air power. He rose to his feet and stepped outside. The snow blinded him for a moment. Across the valley, he could see the jagged silhouettes of panzers abandoned in rows, their engines frozen solid. Some crews had drained the last drops of fuel to start fires, their tanks turned into makeshift shelters. A mechanic knelt beside one of the machines, siphoning the final trickle of gasoline into a flask. Richter approached him. "Why bother?" he asked quietly. The mechanic looked up with hollow eyes. "So I can burn my letters before the Americans find them." Richter stared at him, then walked on. The realization struck like a physical blow. The war was no longer about ground gained or lost, but about survival. Every German soldier in the Ardennes knew it now, even if Berlin refused to see. Later that morning, a dispatch rider arrived on a battered motorcycle, his face white with frost. He handed Richter a sealed message marked Führer Hauptquartier. Inside, a single line scrawled in pencil: "Hold at all costs. Reinforcements are on the way." Richter let out a short, bitter laugh. Reinforcements. What could they possibly send? Boys from the Volkssturm with rifles from 1918? He folded the note, placed it into the fire, and watched it curl into ash. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Germany is running on fumes." The wind outside carried the sound away into the forest, where somewhere, faintly, American tank engines were already growing louder. December 23, 1944, near L'Église, Belgium. The third day without movement. The panzers stood silent, their great guns pointed uselessly toward the west. Around them, the men dug into the snow, creating makeshift foxholes with bayonets and helmets. The storm had passed, revealing a sky so clear and cold it cut like glass. From the ridge above, Oberst Joachim Richter could see the whole valley, a graveyard of steel. Blackened tigers, overturned half-tracks, trucks split open like tin cans. Every few hours, American artillery whistled down from the hills, churning the snow into fountains of fire. His radio crackled weakly, static drowning out the voice. "This is Kampfgruppe Piper, surrounded. Fuel exhausted, attempting breakout east." The transmission dissolved into white noise. Richter lowered the handset. He knew what that meant. Piper's column was finished. The SS commander would later abandon his tanks. leading his men on foot through the forest. They would escape. Barely. Leaving their armored pride behind them, the mighty German offensive had turned into a retreat of ghosts. As night fell, the men huddled in the wreckage of a barn. One of them, a young corporal named Weber, stared into the embers. "Do you think Berlin knows?" he asked quietly. Richter didn't answer. Weber continued, voice trembling. "They say the Führer still believes we'll reach Antwerp, that we're just regrouping." Richter took off his gloves, exposing his cracked, bleeding hands. "Berlin believes in maps," he said finally. "Not in roads full of dead men." A low rumble echoed through the night. Engines, hundreds of them. American tanks advancing from the south. The sound was steady, relentless, mechanical. It was the sound of a war machine that never stopped. At dawn, the first Allied patrols appeared along the ridge. M4 Shermans and infantry in white camouflage moved with precision, covering one another with disciplined efficiency. The Germans opened fire, but their shots were wild, desperate. Within minutes, artillery answered from beyond the hills and the sky erupted again. Richter ordered his men to fall back through the forest. He could feel the ground shake with every detonation. The once proud Panzer Grenadiers were now reduced to scattered groups, slipping through the trees like hunted animals. In the confusion, one of the last fuel trucks, a captured American tanker they had protected for days, was hit by a shell. It exploded with a thunderous roar, a fireball rising so high it seemed to touch the heavens. The blast threw Richter to the ground. Snow and soot rained down around him. When he rose coughing, the valley below was burning. The truck's remains glowed like molten iron. The last of their fuel, the symbol of their fleeting success, was gone. He turned to the few men still standing. Their eyes were empty, their faces gray with exhaustion. "Abandon the vehicles," he said hoarsely. "We move on foot. East. Now." As they trudged into the forest, the snow crunching beneath their boots, Richter looked back one last time. The battlefield was silent except for the crackle of flames and the distant hum of Allied engines closing in. The German dream of victory in the Ardennes, of breaking through to Antwerp, of turning the war's tide, lay buried beneath the snow. And in that moment, Richter understood. This was not a battle anymore. It was a slow, cold surrender to inevitability. December 26, 1944. East of L'Église, Ardennes Forest. The forest was deathly quiet now, blanketed in an unnatural calm. Only the soft crunch of boots and the occasional whisper of wind disturbed the silence. The men of Oberst Joachim Richter's battalion moved in single file through the trees, gaunt and frostbitten, their uniforms stiff with ice. The once proud banners of the Wehrmacht had been reduced to rags. For 3 days they had marched east away from the collapsing front. No food, no fuel, barely any ammunition. The panzers were long gone, abandoned to the snow like iron monuments to a dying empire. Richter walked at the rear, keeping his men moving, his mind distant. Each step felt heavier than the last. Every direction looked the same, a frozen labyrinth of white and gray. He knew the Americans were closing in behind them, sweeping through the Ardennes like a steel tide. They passed a wrecked Tiger half buried in snow. Its crew had frozen beside it, huddled around an empty fuel drum. Someone had carved words into the metal with a bayonet. Ohne Benzin kein Krieg. Without fuel, no war. Richter paused, his breath catching in the cold air. Those 4 words said everything. He reached out, brushing the frost from the hull, then moved on. By midday, they stumbled upon a narrow road littered with wreckage and discarded weapons. Far ahead, through the thinning mist, came the unmistakable rumble of engines. Not German this time, but American. "Patrols," one of the men whispered. Richter raised a hand, signaling them to take cover. But it was too late. A voice rang out across the snow, sharp and commanding. "Hands up! Don't move!" Out of the haze emerged a line of American infantry, rifles leveled, helmets gleaming under the pale sun. Behind them, the green shapes of Sherman tanks loomed like watchful giants. The war for these men was still alive. For Richter's, it was finished. He stood tall, unholstered his sidearm and slowly placed it in the snow. Around him, his soldiers did the same, laying down their rifles with trembling hands. The Americans advanced cautiously, their weapons steady, but their eyes held something unexpected. Pity. A young U.S. lieutenant approached. "You the officer in charge?" Richter nodded. "Oberst Joachim Richter, Wehrmacht." His voice was steady, but there was a faint rasp, exhaustion layered with resignation. The lieutenant glanced at the tattered remnants of the German unit, then back at Richter. "You picked the wrong war to run out of gas, Colonel." Richter gave a faint, humorless smile. "We ran out of everything long before the fuel. The Americans escorted them down the road toward the rear lines. Along the way, Richter passed the shattered remains of his own offensive, overturned tanks, burnt convoys, dead horses still harnessed to supply carts. Each wreck was a marker on the road to defeat. As they neared Stavelot again, he could see the same valley where it had all begun, where 50,000 gallons of American fuel had once promised a spark of victory. The depot was gone now, just scorched earth beneath the snow. He stopped for a moment, staring at the blackened ground. The lieutenant turned, curious. "What is it?" Richter's eyes lingered on the ruins. "This is where we thought we'd won," he exhaled slowly. "And this is where I realized we were already lost." The column moved on, disappearing into the gray horizon. Above them, Allied bombers droned toward Germany, their silhouettes cutting across the pale winter sky, symbols of a world that would soon move on without the Reich. In the snow behind them, the last footprints of the Ardennes offensive faded beneath the falling flakes, erased by the very winter that had once concealed their advance. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and with it so was Germany's final hope.